The ink dried slowly on the parchment, its thick black lines curling like vines across the royal decree. The wax seal glinted dully beneath the chandeliers, as if it too feared the silence that ruled the court of Ormonde. No one dared to speak above a murmur. No one laughed, and no one, especially not His Royal Highness, smiled. Prince Alaric of Ormonde, first heir to the Crescent throne and victor of 3 provincial campaigns, sat unmoving upon the dais, his profile carved like the alabaster busts lining the great hall. 29 years old, cloaked in navy and gold, he was a man raised on discipline and isolation. No portraits of his mother hung in the palace. His father's laughter had died with the war, and the Queen Dowager, forever in mourning, treated joy as a contagion best avoided. His court reflected his silence. Ladies of rank whispered from behind fans like conspirators, noblemen bowed with precision and calculation, and every servant who passed the marble hallways learned quickly. Presence was tolerated, attention was not. Pages walked soundlessly. Councillors presented reports in tones so measured they might have been delivering eulogies. Ormonde did not breathe. It endured, until this morning. She arrived unnoticed, as many things did. Her name was Miss Honora Lark, daughter of the disgraced Reverend Lark of Elmcote, orphaned and housed by reluctant cousins who viewed her presence as both obligation and blemish. She had been handed to the Office of Records with no introduction, only a letter of recommendation secured by someone's guilt and no one's affection. Her gloves were neatly mended but pale. Her shoes creaked faintly at the heel. Her presence, as expected, went unremarked, but her inkpot did not. At precisely 10 o'clock, the royal court gathered for the ratification of the Northern Accord, a treaty drafted over 6 grueling months and written in the precise hand of Master Cartwright, the court scribe. All Honora had been tasked to do, her first and only duty, was to transcribe a fair copy for ceremonial storage. She was careful, always careful. But her hands trembled slightly under the vaulted ceiling, and the eyes of men who saw through you without ever seeing you at all. As the final page of the treaty was being signed by the prince himself, she reached for her pen. The inkpot wobbled, an almost imperceptible sway, and then tipped. The inky black stain bled across the bottom margin of the decree, a blot like spilled wine, a blemish against 6 months of diplomacy, a visible spreading sin, and into the silence, into a room that had not heard mirth in years, Honora Lark, who had never before spoken aloud in court, gasped and said the unforgivable. Oops. The word hung there, a single syllable, light and accidental, almost absurd. Heads turned, eyes widened, several ladies covered their mouths. The court froze. And slowly, very slowly, Prince Alaric looked up from the stained decree. He stared at her, and for the first time in the memory of every lord, lady, servant, and scholar present, he smiled. It was not a smirk or a sneer. It was quiet, half-formed, uncertain, as if his mouth had forgotten how. No one spoke. Honora stood rooted, her cheeks flaming. The prince's gaze lingered just a moment longer, then he looked away. But the silence that followed was no longer the same. Something had cracked, something had begun. The court, having recovered its breath, resumed its duties with a brittle composure. The decree was removed, Master Cartwright began muttering about vellum replacements, and Honora was whisked into the shadows of the chamber by a matron with fingernails like claws and perfume like wilted lilies. Her apology was not accepted, nor refused. It was simply swallowed by protocol, like a stone vanishing into water. But the prince's smile had not gone unnoticed. It rippled through the court like a stain of its own kind. Rumours, subtle as breath and swift as fire, began to curl around Honora's name before noon had struck the great brass clock. By the time luncheon was laid in the East Gallery, every woman of consequence had learned 3 things: that the prince had smiled, that the cause was a mere scribe, and that the girl had uttered the word oops as if it were not an offence punishable by silence. Honora was not invited to luncheon, of course. She was expected to remain in the records chamber, organizing decrees and ensuring her inkpot was better behaved. But she could hear them, Beyond the tapestry-draped corridor, the laughter more forced than usual, the questions framed with poison-tipped curiosity. Did you see her gloves? Not even black. She's not even of County Ormond, an orphan from Elmcote, they say. And she spoke, in court, without permission. I nearly wept for tradition. Honora kept her head bowed, shoulders taut. She sorted parchments with mechanical focus, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She had lived in worse shadows, she told herself. At least here she had a roof, a task, a room with light. And yet that smile haunted her. Not because it had been given to her, but because it had meant something. No one smiled at her, not with interest, not with recognition, not with the quiet astonishment she had seen in Prince Alaric's eyes, as though he had glimpsed something forgotten, something human. That afternoon, as tradition dictated, the prince walked the North Gardens, accompanied by his steward and 2 guards. He did this daily, speaking to no one, eyes fixed ahead, hands clasped behind his back. He walked not for pleasure, but ritual, an act of motion in a life locked in stasis. But today, as he rounded the hedge of ancient boxwood, he paused, just briefly. For there, by the stone bench under the hawthorn tree, stood Honora. She wasn't supposed to be there. No scribe walked the gardens. But a message from Lady Vexley had been misdelivered, and she had been sent to retrieve it. The gardener had given her vague directions, and in her haste she had turned the wrong way, coming face to face with the prince and his entourage. She froze. He did not. Their eyes met again. Just a breath. Just a moment. Then he said, quietly, so quietly that the steward turned in surprise, "You are the girl who corrected my decree." It was not a question. Honora, mortified, dropped a curtsy so low her knees ached. "Your Highness, I apologize. I did not mean—" "Do not apologize," he said. It was honest. The steward looked as though he might faint. The guards blinked. Honora, confused, dared to raise her gaze. "I beg pardon?" The prince turned. "Most here would rather bleed than say what they mean." And then he walked on. No one spoke of it at dinner, but by morning every corridor whispered it anew. The prince had spoken to her again, and worse, he had defended her. From that day forward, doors began to close just as she approached. Quills fell silent when she entered. The glances that followed her through the corridors were no longer indifferent. They were sharp. She had broken the rule most sacred in Ormond. To be unseen was safe, and she was no longer unseen. Before she ever spilled ink in the presence of a prince, Honora Lark had been a girl with wind-chapped hands and a silence too old for her years. Elmcote was not a town, but a collection of grudges, where the church bell tolled louder than laughter, and the vicarage garden grew nettles faster than roses. Her father, Reverend Elias Lark, had not been a cruel man, only a tired one, tired of sermons no one heard, and sins too ordinary to condemn. His eyes had held warmth once when Honora was a child, but after her mother died of fever in the winter of 13, his gaze turned inward. His sermons grew erratic, his faith brittle, and the church trustees, ever watchful of appearances, found a reason, any reason, to strip him of his post. They said he had mismanaged church funds, that he'd let poor children sleep in the nave during storms, that he quoted scripture too selectively. But what they truly meant was that Elias Lark did not keep grief at arm's length. He let it bleed into his work, into his daughter's life. Honora was 14 when they were forced to leave the vicarage. They took only what fit into the cart, 2 blankets, a trunk of sermons, and her mother's pressed linen shawl. Her father died 3 winters later, coughing blood into a handkerchief in the back room of a curate's barn. She had held his hand. She had not cried. The letter summoning her to Ormonde came 6 months later, from a cousin she barely knew. Lady Corinna Haywater, widow of Lord Haywater's younger son, wrote with clipped benevolence. "It is not fitting for a girl of your name to live among charity," she wrote. "You will find modest employment here. Speak little and you shall do well." Lady Haywater had meant it kindly in her way. She gave Honora a room in the attic, 2 dresses, and a reference to the Office of Records. She taught her which fork to use, which streets to avoid, and how to curtsy low enough to suggest humility but never breeding. Yet beneath every gesture was the same cold refrain: be small, be quiet, be grateful. And Honora was, or at least she pretended to be. But she wrote letters at night. To no one at first, just pages of thoughts and questions and half-remembered prayers. She wrote about fairness, about justice, about the unbearable weight of being tolerated but never chosen. And she taught herself to copy legal phrases, to understand the difference between a ratified charter and a ceremonial decree. She began to recognize the ink colors used by various lords. She memorized the dates when the prince last amended court law. She studied silently, doggedly when no one saw, because someday, she told herself, knowledge would matter more than name. Someday, someone might see her, not as an obligation, not as a charity case or mistake, but as a mind. It had not occurred to her that such a moment might arrive so clumsily. And yet, that single accident, one trembling hand, one toppled inkpot, had cracked the mask of courtly indifference wider than all her years of silence. She had not intended to be noticed. She had only tried to do her task. But she had noticed him. When he smiled, it wasn't with amusement. It was recognition, brief, fragile, but real, as though he too understood what it meant to be visible only in theory, not in truth. Now the days moved differently, not freer but tenser. Her name was whispered in corners. Her work was scrutinized twice over. A steward returned a document she'd copied, claiming her penmanship too eager. One clerk, a pale-eyed youth named Brant, stopped offering her a nod in the morning. Even Lady Haywater began watching her with renewed caution, as if Honora had stepped out of the neat margins in which she'd been drawn. Hand still, she could not forget the way Prince Alaric had said the word honest, as if he hadn't tasted it in years, as if it frightened him too. The corridors of Ormond Palace were like veins, each narrow, each pulsing with the life of those who thought themselves vital, and each lined with portraits whose eyes followed Honora now in a way they never had before. She had not spoken to the prince again, nor had she tried, but the echo of his words and, more hauntingly, the memory of his smile, lingered within her like a scent in a closed room. She dared not hope. Hope was for those with names that opened doors and fathers who were not buried quietly behind chapels. But curiosity, that sharp, clean thing, grew daily in her. So she began to watch, to read, to remember. Each evening after her tasks, Honora returned to the dusty records chamber, long after the other clerks had gone. She brought no candle. She knew the layout by heart. It was there, by the shelves marked ratified, that she began comparing recent decrees to earlier versions. Not out of defiance, but instinct. And what she found unsettled her. Several of the prince's signed orders had been altered in subtle ways, changes so minor the eye might skim past them. A single clause reworded, a date corrected in pencil, not ink. Nothing ruinous, but enough to suggest that someone had dared to touch the sanctity of his decree after signature. At first, she thought it a simple error, but the pattern grew. Each change favored the same few landholders, names she remembered from whispered hallway conversations and unsealed envelopes left half-hidden on desks: Langdon, Vestra, and of course, Lord Sebastian Hale. Lord Hale was not a man. He was an institution. Tall, silver-haired and precise, he had served as Chancellor of Ormond for 19 years. His word was treated as gospel by most of the court. He rarely raised his voice. He never looked down. And he had never once, in 3 years, spoken directly to Honora. But she had seen his seal in the altered documents. Small, faint, but there. She began copying them, discreetly, one by one. She hid them in the lining of her trunk, beneath the worn hem of her late mother's shawl. She practiced the script of legal citations until her wrist ached. And when she could not sleep, she imagined standing before the prince, placing the scrolls before him, and saying with perfect clarity, "These are not your words, your highness." But such dreams were dangerous. So she guarded them as one guards a candle in wind. Still, others noticed. One late afternoon, as she slipped into the records chamber, she found someone already there. The chambermaid, Liza. Liza was a girl of few words, with quick hands and eyes always darting toward escape. But tonight, she did not flee. Instead, she stood beside the ledger shelf, holding a small pouch of herbs meant for the ledgers, lavender and cedar to keep out the moths. "Miss Lark," she said, her tone low, careful. Honora startled. "Liza, I thought you'd gone." The maid did not smile, but she stepped forward, and with a glance toward the hall, she reached into her apron and pressed something into Honora's hand, a folded scrap of parchment. "Wasn't mine," Liza whispered. "Dropped by Master Cartwright. Thought you ought to see." And then she was gone. Honora unfolded the note. It was brief, barely more than a list. "Alter text before Tuesday. The prince must not see Clause 5 as is. Let Hale review. Use old signature if needed. Quietly." There was no name, but there didn't need to be. Her heart thundered, and for the first time since her arrival in Ormond, Honora Lark realized she was holding something more powerful than respect. She was holding proof, and someone else knew. The hall was dressed in its finest that morning. Gold braid lined the scarlet banners, and the floor had been scrubbed to a shine so bright it threatened to reveal every step, every shame. Today was not a feast nor a ball. It was the quarterly session of royal ratification, when decrees and policies passed by the council were presented before the prince for final signatory approval. It was meant to be ceremonial, predictable, controlled. But as Honora walked behind the archivist, carrying the prepared scrolls in her gloved hands, she felt the air taut as wire. Her heart beat in her throat. Her gloves, once pale and invisible, now seemed almost defiant against the polished austerity of the room. The nobles had gathered with anticipation sharpened to points. Lord Hale sat at the prince's right, his seal box gleaming beside his ledger. His face betrayed nothing, but Honora saw the flicker in his eyes when she entered. Recognition, distrust, calculation. Prince Alaric, solemn as ever, took his seat without flourish. His expression, carved from the same stillness that ruled his court, showed no hint of the smile she had once seen. But his gaze found her, for a fraction of a second. A glance that tethered her, steadied her. The clerk began to read. It was the final decree that mattered, an amendment regarding the land rights of minor tenants in the outer districts. To the nobles, a footnote. To Honora, a crime. She stepped forward when summoned, placing the scroll on the ceremonial table. But it was not the scroll she had been given that morning. It was the one she had copied the night before. The true version, with the original Clause 5 restored. The version that showed the council's attempt to strip entitlements from border tenants and grant them instead to Lord Hale's estates. Gasps were immediate. Lord Hale's eyes narrowed. His hand reached for the document. "This is not the approved draft," he said coldly. "There has been an error. Return it. We will rectify—" But Prince Alaric raised his hand. Silence fell. He read, carefully, word by word, line by line. The weight of the court shifted as he paused over Clause 5. His brow creased, not in confusion but in memory. He turned to Honora. "Where did you acquire this draft?" Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed it in the dark, over and over. "It is the original, Your Highness. The version you signed 3 weeks ago, the one altered in the records by someone else." She did not look at Lord Hale. She did not need to. The room rippled. A dowager dropped her fan. Someone whispered, "Forgery?" in a tone usually reserved for betrayal. Lord Hale rose. "This is outrageous," he thundered. "She is a scribe, not a legal witness. This girl has overstepped her bounds with impudence and—" "She speaks," Alaric interrupted, "with specificity." His voice had not risen, but the air changed. He looked again at the scroll, then at the steward. "Bring me the version from the Chancellor's box." There was a delay, a rustling, a stammered excuse, and then the truth bloomed. The version in Lord Hale's box bore a different signature date. The language was altered. The claws stripped of its protections, and the seal had been pressed with a faint smear, as though applied over old wax. Alaric stood. He did not yell, he did not accuse, but when he held up both scrolls, his own original and the forged replacement, the court watched a kingdom's ritual crack in two. "There has been treason in ink," he said softly, "and someone thought me blind." He did not name Hale. He did not need to. The weight of the silence was a sentence in itself, and Honora, still holding her gloves in her left hand, still trembling in places no one could see, knew the unravelling had begun. The court descended not into chaos, but into a silence so brittle it could have shattered under breath alone. Lord Hale did not sit. He stood with the confidence of a man who had shaped laws longer than most in the room had drawn breath. His voice, when it came, was laced with authority sharpened by habit. "I have served this crown faithfully for nearly 2 decades. To imply I would, on a whim, alter a royal decree for personal gain is not only absurd, it is dangerous." His eyes did not flicker to Honora. She is a girl with no standing, no lineage, a scribe brought in under suspect recommendations. His words were chosen like scalpels. "Is this the path now?" he asked the room, "where those who misplace ink are allowed to accuse noblemen without proof? I have never seen this version before, this original, as she calls it." Alaric's gaze never left him. "You did. 3 weeks ago. You initialed the copy before it reached me." There was a murmur from the nobles. Lady Vestra, who rarely spoke above a whisper, took half a step forward. "If this is true," she said carefully, "should we not consider the implications for other documents passed in recent sessions?" "No," Lord Hale snapped. "This is a clerical confusion, perhaps even sabotage, by someone hoping to draw attention." His glance, at last, cut toward Honora. It stung more than she expected, not because of the insult, but because it was the first time he had truly seen her. Alaric nodded once, and 2 guards approached Lord Hale's side, not to seize, but to shadow, to make clear that scrutiny had been summoned. "You may remain, Lord Chancellor," the prince said, his voice like distant thunder, "but until this matter is resolved, you will not handle court decrees." It was a quiet devastation, one that would echo beyond the walls. Lord Hale bowed stiffly, like a tree snapping in frost. "As your Highness commands." He turned then, not to the prince, not to the nobles, but to Honora. "You have opened a wound in this court," he said. "Do not be proud of it. Wounds bleed." Her reply was not spoken aloud. She simply held his gaze and did not look away. That evening she returned to her small attic room to find her trunk overturned, the hem of her mother's shawl tugged out, the lining torn. They had searched for the documents she'd hidden. They had found nothing, because they were no longer there. She had placed the most damning scroll, along with her hand-copied comparisons, into a sealed envelope that morning. It had been delivered by stable boy to a barrister's office in town, a barrister who had once owed her father a debt of honor, one she had been saving quietly for 3 years. Retaliation had come quickly, but so had her answer. That night, just before the oil lamps were dimmed, a soft knock tapped against her door. It was Liza again. She did not enter. She only handed Honora a folded note. One line, written in neat, steady hand. "You did not imagine it. I remember the clause. I will speak, if needed. T. Aldwyn, the steward." Honora stared at the paper long after the footsteps faded. They were trying to frighten her. But fear had already made a home in her years ago. Now she had proof, and witnesses, and the prince had seen it all. By morning, the corridors of Ormond Palace moved with the careful pace of a house mourning something not yet buried. The scrolls had been sealed away. The prince had not appeared at breakfast. Lord Hale, though still nominally in position, had excused himself from his usual duties, citing illness brought on by the damp. No one believed him, but the nobles spoke, quietly, dangerously, and not of Hale. They spoke of her. An orphan and a scribe, bringing ruin with a blot of ink. She's clever, yes, but cleverness is not the same as loyalty. The prince protects her. It's unnerving. That word, protects, spread like perfume in a closed salon, clinging to tapestries, to linens, to the very air. Honora became the subject of more than rumour. She became suggestion. Lady Vestra invited her to tea under the pretext of clarifying details. Lord Finchley asked her to review a past decree to ensure no more discrepancies. Invitations that had never been extended before now piled on her work desk, each wrapped in a ribbon and signed with false warmth. And yet, none of it was kind. It was surveillance dressed in civility. By the third day, the tension bloomed in the very room where it began. The prince had summoned the court, not for judgment, not for spectacle, but for clarity. The Chancellor's temporary suspension was to be formalized, and the stewards instructed to begin a review of all past decrees issued within the past 5 years. It was there, beneath the same chandeliers where ink had once spilled, that the first crack in Honora appeared. Lady Haywater had arrived earlier than usual. She stood to Honora's left, not speaking until the prince took his seat. Then, with a smile tight as ribbon, she leaned toward her. "This has all gone too far," she murmured. "You've drawn too much notice. Men in your station do not forget such things." Honora turned. "I am not a man, Lady Haywater." "No," the Dowager said, "which is why it will be worse for you." That evening, Aldwyn approached her near the side hall, holding a folded paper. His hand trembled slightly. "It's from His Highness," he said, then hesitated. "He wishes to speak privately. No attendance." She unfolded the note. It bore only a time and a place. The West Library, the one overlooking the Frost Garden. When she entered, he was already there, standing by the window, watching the moonlight stretch across the marble path outside. He did not turn when she stepped forward. "I had not remembered the clause," he said softly. "Not until you placed it before me." She waited. "Sometimes I wonder," he continued, "how many things I've signed without seeing. How much of this kingdom was written without my voice, in my name." Now he looked at her. No crown, no robe, just the man beneath the title. "You reminded me that I have one." There was no flattery in it, just weight, and with it came another silence, thicker, slower, filled with something unspoken. "You have made enemies," he said finally. She nodded. "I know. They will try to discredit you, offer you coin or threat." "Yes. You could leave." She looked at him fully now. "I could," she said. "But then who would know the shape of the truth?" And then for the second time in court history, Prince Alaric smiled. But this one was not small. It was sad, and proud, and hollowed at the edges. "You are braver than anyone here," he said. She felt her throat tighten. Not because of the compliment, but because for the first time in her life, someone had said it as though it were already known. Not a surprise, not a marvel, a fact. And yet that same night, as she returned to her room, she found the door cracked open. Inside, the shawl her mother once wore had been cut in two, and across the pillow, written in charcoal, "Scribes should not speak." The cost of being seen had arrived, and it had teeth. The morning after the message was scrawled across her pillow, Honora did not cry. She folded the ruined shawl with steady hands and placed it gently at the bottom of her trunk. The charcoal marks on the linens were scrubbed away before any chambermaid could see. She did not report it. She did not even flinch. But when she stepped into the court of Ormond that day, something in her posture had changed. Not defiance, not pride, certainty. The prince watched her enter from the dais, noting the precision of her steps, the clean part in her hair, the gloves still pale despite the scorn they had drawn. Around them, the court buzzed with new discomfort, no longer wondering whether she belonged, but now why she remained. Because she had not been dismissed, because the prince had not forgotten, and because she had not yielded to the weight of whispered threats. The midday session was brief, an announcement from the stewards, declaring an independent review council would be assembled to investigate the Chancellor's office. Lord Hale, though not yet formally charged, had voluntarily withdrawn to his country estate for reflection. No apology was issued, no guilt confessed, but everyone understood what it meant. When the court adjourned, the nobles did not linger, but the prince remained seated, and before she could turn to leave, his voice carried across the floor. "Miss Lark." The room froze. Those still present stopped pretending not to listen. Honora turned. "Yes, Your Highness?" His eyes did not waver. "Approach." She did so slowly, the sound of her shoes against the marble echoing like punctuation. When she reached him, he did not stand, but his gaze held hers. "You have uncovered more than negligence," he said, not loudly but clearly. "You have exposed the complacency of this court, and my own." She waited. Her hands were folded, gloves neat, face calm. "I have offered no reward," he continued, "no defense, no appointment." "I didn't expect one," she said. "And yet," he said, "you have held the line." He paused, then looked toward Aldwin, who stepped forward holding a rolled document. "Effective immediately, you are appointed royal documentarian to the office of the prince," Alaric said. "You will report directly to me. All future decrees shall pass through your review before final sealing." A gasp. A sharp breath drawn by Lady Vestra. "But she's a—" someone began. The prince's voice cut through. "She is the only one here who remembered what I wrote." Honora's breath caught. She blinked once, but she did not falter. "Do you accept this appointment?" he asked. She did not look toward the nobles, not toward Lady Haywater, who stood trembling with restrained fury near the side door. "I accept, Your Highness," Honora said, "with gratitude and resolve." Then he said, standing now, his height commanding yet calm, "Let it be known, deception may find doors in this court, but truth will always find mine." And then he offered her something no one had expected. He bowed, slightly, but unmistakably. The prince bowed to the scribe. The gasps were louder now. She curtsied in response, not low, not overly practiced, but as herself. That evening the outer estate walls echoed with the sound of a departing carriage. It was Lady Haywater's. She left without farewell. The next morning, her maid, red-eyed and quiet, delivered Honora a small wrapped parcel. Inside was a velvet ribbon, deep navy, the kind worn by women in mourning or rising from it, and with it a single note. "You were never invisible, child. You were just inconvenient." Honora folded the note, tied the ribbon at her wrist, and stepped out into the new morning. Not as a shadow, not as a mistake, but as someone finally and irrevocably seen. The echo of that court session lingered far beyond the velvet drapes and polished halls. In the weeks that followed, the usual thrum of nobility resumed. Carriages clattered, silver was polished, and orchestras tuned for dinners none would remember. But the court itself had changed. They no longer whispered if the prince favored the scribe, they whispered why. Some suggested guilt, others admiration. A few insisted it was a quiet romance born of scandal. But no one could explain the simple daily truth. She had not left. Honora Lark remained. Her new office was modest, tucked between the conservatory and the lower archive vaults. Yet it bore her name on a polished plaque, a luxury many born to titles did not possess. She received daily bundles of parchment for review, her edits returned with neat marginalia, and her approval required before any seal touched wax. Servants now greeted her with bowed heads. Even those who avoided her eyes did not dare exclude her from the rituals of respect. Aldwin, once only a steward, now stood often at her door, silent, dependable, and watchful. But the silence around her was a different sort. Gone was the indifference of nobility. In its place came an unease made of unspoken debts and unyielding memory. Lord Hale did not return to court. Rumours abounded that he'd retired under duress, that a health condition had overtaken him, or that the prince had offered him a choice between disgrace and disappearance. No one said the word forgery, but it hovered like a stain on fine paper. His seal box was officially transferred to a new deputy, a man who, within his first week, invited Honora to inspect each document personally. Some resisted this new world. Lady Vestra refused to speak directly to her. Lord Fenchley sent notes through aides, signed but never personalized. And Lady Haywater, though absent from the palace, left her mark in exile. Honora's name was struck from her family's ledger. Her allowance, small, symbolic, was quietly cancelled. But what remained was weight. Weight in the way the prince deferred to her opinion in court. Weight in how other scribes glanced at her when crossing the hall, part reverence, part fear. And weight most of all in the letters that began arriving from outside the court. One from a solicitor in Redmore, who believed a clause had been misfiled in a land grant to his client. One from a schoolteacher in Dunley, requesting clarification on a new education tariff that had stripped funding from her district. They were addressed not to the office of the prince, but to Miss Honora Lark, royal documentarian. And in the quiet hours, when the sky turned to pearl and the ink dried slower on the parchment, she replied to each by hand. Not because she was required to, but because someone had to care what the words meant. One evening, as she closed her ledger and trimmed the lamp's flame, she found the prince waiting outside her office door. No guards, no retinue, just him. "I had expected you to leave," he said softly. "I was told I should." "And yet," she smiled, just enough to show she understood the weight of his two words. "I stayed because this is not their court anymore," she said. "Not entirely." He nodded. "Nor mine." A pause, and then quietly, "It could be ours, you know. Not in name, but in what it chooses to become." She did not answer with words. She stepped aside, allowing him into the room. He sat across from her at the long table. No papers between them, no scrolls, just silence and the scent of fresh ink. And for a moment, the Palace of Ormonde did not feel cold. It felt possible. That night, the wind shifted across the eastern gardens. The tapestries no longer stirred in dread, but in breath. The hallways were not hushed, but contemplative, and the shadows that had once clung to Honora's footsteps now followed her not in menace but in memory. The court would forget many things, but not the day a girl with trembling hands spilled ink across a lie and rewrote the truth instead. Years later, the ledger still sat upon the shelf, spine faded, corners curled. Inside, its pages bore the ink of both empires and errors, laws that changed borders, treaties that prevented wars, charters that protected the unseen. On the inside cover, in neat, unadorned script, was a single name, Honora Lark, documentarian. There were those who claimed she had been too clever for her own good, that she had married ambition with idealism and made enemies more powerful than any crown could shield her from. But history is not written by comfort. It is written in the margins, by those who refuse to stay in them. She never rose to a title. There was no barony, no knighthood, no portrait hung in the grand hall. But she sat, year after year, in the chamber where ink met law, and each time a document reached the royal seal, it passed through her hands first. The prince never named her openly in council, but she sat beside him always. When questioned about changes to policy, he would glance in her direction, and when nobles argued the definition of truth, he would smile, almost invisibly, and say, "Miss Lark would know." It became a phrase, Miss Lark would know. And so, it was not her name that carved itself into the foundations of Ormonde. It was her certainty, her refusal to be small, her quiet insistence that what is written matters. When the prince fell ill in his later years, it was said she was the last person he asked to see, that she sat beside him in the garden where they first spoke after the ink had spilled, and read to him from the oldest ledgers, her voice steady, as his grew faint. She never spoke of that day, but the pages she read remained in the library after his death, annotated in the margins in two different hands. She left the court not long after. No announcement, no ceremony. A single carriage carried her to the edge of the city, where the trees grew thick and the air smelled of leaves instead of ink. A cottage, modest, a garden, overgrown, and a study filled with scrolls no longer sealed. Occasionally letters still arrived, some bearing royal wax, others sent by those who had heard whispers of the girl who once corrected a prince. She answered only those that asked why, not how. She never married. Not out of sorrow, but because her days were full, and her heart had never been built to be claimed like land. She walked the forest paths in silence, learning again the names of things not written down: moss, frost, quiet. Years later, when the Library of Ormonde was expanded, a new wing was constructed. Among the additions was a reading alcove with a long stone bench. Upon it, no statue, no plaque, just a line carved into the wall behind: "She remembered what we forgot." Visitors rarely asked who it referred to, but those who knew would lower their voice as they passed, and the scribes would glance to the ledgers with something like reverence. And still, no one dared mention her name again, but every room remembered her.